this episode of the Business Communicators.
In a court of law, everyone deserves representation. Does everybody deserve PR representation? And you often see it pop up during moments of crisis.
You're listening to the Business Communicators. And now your hosts, Austin Stepp and Thomas Bain.
Welcome to Season 5, Episode 15 of the Business Communicators, the number one communications and marketing podcast in the world. And Thomas, we say that's a verifiable fact. We don't really have data to back it up, but we're just gonna roll with it. But
well, I laugh and chuckle because I remember when we first started this out, we were the number 5 podcast of
Egypt.
All podcasts of Egypt.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened, but we'll take it.
We'll take the number 1 verifiable of business communications, covering all things business communications.
Exactly. Well, here in a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Eleanor Hawkins from Axios for an episode that we're incredibly excited about. So if you're watching this on LinkedIn Live or any of the platforms right now, let us know where you're listening or watching from. And if you have comments, questions, or anything like that, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we'll try to get to as many as we can throughout the conversation. But if you want to follow our work, just search @BizCommunicator on all the social platforms. We're there. And Thomas, I guess let's just go ahead and get right into it. So we've got Eleanor Hawkins joining us. So she is a communication strategist and writer at Axios. And if you're not familiar with her work, you should be. The Axios Communicators newsletter is probably one of my favorite reads. It's one of the newsletters that I wish was probably sent more than just once a week, to be honest, but covers topics and trends that impact how leaders, brands, and employers communicate. And prior to joining Axios, she held various strategic communications roles with government, politics, public policy, and media. Of course, you can follow her on X @emayhawk. Eleanor Hawkins, welcome to the Business Communicators. We're excited to have you.
Hi, it's so great to be on the number 1 communication podcast. It reminds me of Elf when he's like, "Congratulations, you have the best coffee." Kind of how I feel right now.
Yeah, that's a great movie. I love watching it every year during the holidays. So, I kind of want to start off. You've got a pretty robust communications background, and from my knowledge, it seems that a lot of journalists go from journalism to comms ultimately in their career, and you seem to have done it backwards. What was kind of the thought for you taking on the role at Axios and focusing on kind of the comms approach and covering it, and what has that role been like for you?
Yes, I did it backwards, and not intentionally. I never intended to become a journalist. Obviously, I worked with them quite closely in my career throughout communications. But basically, Axios recognized that no outlet, no mainstream publication was covering communications in a serious way. And so they thought that was a huge missed opportunity. I think it also is really apt for Axios just because they're known for their smart brevity. They're known for the way that they communicate and the way that they report. They also were hearing from business leaders who were saying, my employees aren't reading my internal memos, but they're reading your newsletter. And they kept hearing that over and over and over again. And they're like, how do we find our audience? How do we communicate with people who are on payroll? And so I think they realized pretty quickly, nobody has a magic formula for communication. It's really hard. It's often overlooked, but it's so important and really contributes to the success of a company and of a brand. And so they were like, let's invest some resources. Let's really try to cover this. And so I've been writing Axios Communicators for about a year and a half. And as you said, it's all about just covering the way that different leaders, businesses, brands, employers communicate with all their different stakeholders. And then also examining, the different audience needs, the different stakeholder needs, the way that we're all kind of shifting how we receive information. And so it's been quite interesting. There's been no shortage of things to cover, no shortage of crises, no shortage of innovation happening on the comms front. But yeah, I think it's just such a statement that Axios is investing these resources in this type of coverage.
Yeah, I don't want to make this like a sponsored Axios conversation, but I've been really fascinated with the company since it launched in 2017, and at the previous company that I was at, our head of communications and external relations was really big on Axios. And for our team, we went through, we were probably the first company that was part of the guinea pig trial for, the smart brevity training. And, everyone on our team had to, kind of go through that process. And then, we actually kind of adapted the Axios model for, an in the know newsletter that was sent out on a daily basis. From a comms perspective, how big of a model is kind of that corporate relationship, with Axios and corporations versus, just the news model itself?
Well, so I think what you're referencing is Axios HQ,
Right.
which is an internal comms platform that spun off from Axios probably a little over a year ago, once we were acquired by Cox. So, so while one of our founders is now leading that company, they are separate. What I will say is they take a lot of the same smart brevity formatting and they apply it to internal comms. They do a lot of research that I think is really interesting. So it kind of goes back to what I said before, where people were like, we're having a hard time reaching our employees. They're not paying attention. We're fighting for their attention. And so how do we, take on the smart brevity format? And I will say, as a former communicator, learning smart brevity was tricky. It's really so much easier to be long-winded. It's so much easier to bury the lead. And so it helped me kind of finesse my writing chops and communicate more effectively myself, which has been, a great thing.
I need to sign up for the smart brevity training. I went from public relations to marketing and then got a degree in advanced statistics. And so try forgetting all of your AP writing style and writing academia. And you're like, that wasn't a good move on my part. So I guess my question comes into play is, as you cover business communications, public relations is definitely something that I see a lot in your writing and kind of things like that. One of the big news stories that kind of came out was a PR firm actually paid $350 million for their pushing of OxyContin and other things like that. But you're hearing a bunch of other PR studies or ethical questions coming up. How does that affect the business communications industry, where the ancillary companies are starting to push ethical products?
It's a great question. It's something that I'm looking into and we'll probably cover in the newsletter next week, to be honest with you, because I think it sets an interesting precedent. And it's all about the ethics of which clients do you take on and why. And it's a real tricky predicament for these agencies, because at the end of the day, they do have a business. They do need to make money. But at what cost, right? And somebody said to me when I was, doing some research for this story, in a court of law, everyone deserves representation. Does everybody deserve PR representation? And you often see it pop up during moments of crisis. But yeah, I think this does set a really interesting precedent in that this firm was held liable for something that their clients were doing. I think we'll see maybe more of that, more companies come under scrutiny for their association with other problematic clients. I'll also say that I think the shift in audience is one of the reasons that we're seeing this. People care. People want to know who you're doing business with. They want to know who your vendors are. They want to know that even your vendors align with their beliefs. Employees specifically, that might be where you see the most pressure come from these agencies, is employees who are saying, I don't want to work for a company that pushes X, Y, and Z. I want to work for more mission-driven folks. So that's really where I'm looking at it, is how it sets a precedent for agencies moving forward. But yeah, I do think it's a really interesting case study, and it's something that we're going to examine next week.
Kind of following up on that a little bit, what kind of risk calculus would you recommend, kind of the leaders of these PR firms to look at when, maybe evaluating clients? Because it's not every day that PR firms are paying $350 million in fines. It's definitely unprecedented. So, when kind of going through and looking at that calculus, what advice or counsel would you provide?
Well, I mean, as a reporter, I wouldn't provide any advice.
Fair.
Be open.
What I would say is that I do know many organizations do have ethics. Like I know that there's the PR Council, there's PRSA, there are many membership entities that have tried to establish, some sort of ethical standards and practices. Every company will operate differently, but I do think that it's really fascinating that you're seeing this rise of smaller boutique, but more values mission driven companies. So companies that might be minority owned that really only want to uplift and work with certain clients. That is something that we're seeing happen more and more. And that could be because of this issue. I don't know. But I would say every company has to make money, and, there are always going to be hired guns out there.
It's interesting because when we first started talking about this and researching you and your writing, one of the things that caught me was what you just talked about, was the jumps of PR practitioners jumping from the big shops to the littler companies or starting their own. And I'm just wondering, is that kind of where the future of public relations, advertising, marketing firms, because we've talked about the consolidation, and one executive makes a misstep and they lose 40% of their book of business right off the bat. Is this kind of the cable television saga, but now for the PR firms? Does WPP, Omnicom, and all those have to start watching out?
What I'm seeing, I don't know if they need to watch out, because there will always be those clients with the big budgets who want the big names and are fine with that. What I'm seeing is the space between boutique and giant is just getting greater and greater. I don't know what happens to those firms in the middle. And that's really what I'm paying attention to.
Eleanor, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, I believe it was last January, you were doing an interview, can't recall the publication, but you said that one of the opportunities that communicators are missing is embracing data. And, Thomas has that data analytics background, so he's always looking at the data. But you went on to say that comms teams need to rethink how they're measuring their success, and they should not be afraid of using data to inform the decisions they make. Since you made those comments over a year ago, have you seen any growth in that area? And if so, or if not, what is holding comms pros back?
Thomas, you were laughing at that. I feel like
I'm only chuckling because I get the feeling that they're still using it as lip service more than anything, or they outsource it to their IT department. That's just me personally, and I'm wondering what you're seeing from the outside.
Yeah, I think it's slowly being adopted. What I will say is I'm happy to hear of more and more comms teams. One of the things I ask, let me back up. One of the things that I ask every CCO when I talk to them is, how is your team structured? And more of them have an analytics function within comms, which I think is great. And I think that's a trend. And they're using data to really inform how they communicate. UPS is a really great example of a team like this. And I did a kind of case study on how they communicated around labor negotiations. And they were really operating like a newsroom, and they were using data to inform what they put on their website. They were using data to inform how they messaged certain things. Like they were looking at SEO and what was kind of trending, and they were using those specific words on their website to get viewers and get eyeballs. And so you are seeing more and more companies use data to inform how they communicate. The other thing that I'm seeing more and more of, which is great, is that communicators are intentionally linking their output to business objectives. So it's not just like getting, media coverage for the sake of it, or hitting a certain goal, or having a certain amount of hits. It's all about how that media coverage ties back to the overall objective. And we're seeing teams connect those dots in an intentional way. Every team is going to have their own metrics, but I hope that we are past the point of impressions and the excuse of soft metrics.
I think vanity metrics are starting to go away. I think the good comms people are definitely tying them back to the business on that side. So I echo that sentiment on yours.
And kind of one of the the other big storylines that obviously is on the horizon for us is kind of pivoting off of your newsletter that focused this week on kind of the big game. I don't know if we're allowed to say the other word because of trademark, but you spoke a lot about the advertising that brands are putting into Super Bowl Sunday, and kind of the business or the business side of things. The return on investment. It's not cheap to pay for a 30-minute ad or for a 30-second ad during the Super Bowl. This year, I think, is really unique, obviously, with, the Taylor Swift factor. There's a lot of commentary out there that, you're going to see more ads that are geared toward, women and her fans. I believe Dove has, some messaging out there. They've got a really good ad that they've already been teasing with, Jason Kelsey's wife. And, kind of what do you see on the Super Bowl Sunday, over the next few days in terms of advertising and maybe, some of the benefits of getting involved with so many eyeballs looking at that?
Yeah, I'm hearing the same thing. And my colleagues, Kelly Tycho and Sarah Fisher, wrote a lot about the rise of female-driven brands, and how we'll see more presence during the Super Bowl, probably because of what you just said, and because, whether it's the Taylor Swift effect or not, more women are watching football. What I'm paying attention to is the content of the ads themselves. It's 2024. It is a election year. Everything becomes political. Budweiser has always been a big advertiser during the Super Bowl. It'll be interesting to see how they show up, given the crosshairs that they've been in for the past couple of months. I've heard from marketing experts to expect much more humor-driven advertising.
That's
Very
good news.
light, very celebrity focused. I think I saw a stat that like 90% of the ads will feature a celebrity. So it'll be much more celebrity focused, very light. You are not likely to see ad spots around causes or values or mission. It's going to be much, much lighter than that. And part of it, I think, is nobody wants to be the next Bud Light, but also times are a little heavy right now. So they just want to bring some levity. One mistake that I think brands could make, and this is something a marketing professor pointed out to me, and I think it's so spot on, is like, there's no such thing as necessarily a bad ad. The worst thing you can do is be mediocre in a moment like a Super Bowl and air an ad that could go out at any other point in time, right? Like, it's just not memorable. It doesn't tie back to the business. It's not some sort of a red thread that you can use throughout the rest of the year. He mentioned, if you over-index on celebrity, that could also be a mistake, because then your ad is the, insert celebrity name ad. It's not an ad about your brand. And then you just, spent $7 million promoting a celebrity and not yourself. And I think that's something that we might see here, given how celebrity heavy it will be. The interesting thing is some data from the Harris poll found that only like 1 in 5 want to see influencers in these campaigns. People much prefer animals, celebrities, and like characters from your favorite TV shows or movies. So that's what I'm paying attention to. The other thing that I think is really interesting, given my beat, is how comms and PR agencies are being brought in more and more to help extend the shelf life, the tail of these ads. So whether it's through a digital strategy or through activations, we're seeing more and more of that, which I think is smart. And again, it'll kind of guarantee the ROI. The way that it's been described to me is like, marketing is no longer just an and, it is or an either or. Like, you go on TV or you go digital, it's everything. You have to be everywhere at all times for it to break through. And so that's something that I'm definitely watching. The other thing that I'm watching is AI and how it might make its way into Super Bowl ads and what that means for the future of marketing.
I am kind of curious on the Super Bowl ads, just to provide some behind the scenes. We have like a group thread for the Business Communicators where we share news stories, things we're interested in. And we kind of made comments about a week ago that we were kind of tired of seeing the teasers of the ads, like 2 weeks before the big game. It kind of loses some of its surprise, when you already kind of know what the ad is going to be about 2 weeks before the big game. And kind of on that note, we've got the Olympics coming up this summer, and there are a lot of official sponsors for the International Olympic Committee, but there's also a lot of brands that are going to be involved, supporting different athletes. They might not be official, Team USA sponsors or game sponsors. We look at, Simone Biles, for example. She's represented by a lot of brands. Not all of them are official Team USA sponsors. So when it comes to these marquee events, whether it's the Olympics, whether it's a Super Bowl, the Oscars, or any of these big events, does it make sense to spend all of that money on these $7 million ads for a 30-second spot when you can just leverage digital, which is continuing to grow, like YouTube, Hulu, all of these different ads? Does it make sense from a financial perspective? Is the ROI actually there?
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that. What I can tell you is it's probably easier to place a 30-second ad during the Super Bowl than it is to come up with a intense digital strategy and find those niche outlets,
Sure.
like that's where my mind goes, is that it's an easier strategy. It's a guarantee that you'll get in front of 100 million people. But if you're a very niche brand and you have a very niche following, does it make more sense for you to target them? I think a prime example of this is the platform called Notion. Like, they are really trying to reach young people, developers, engineers, etc. And so they really target like very specific podcasts and TikTok accounts, and they're able to find that niche audience to break through and not only turn those audience members into users, but into spokespeople and evangelists for their brand. And sometimes that's more important than reaching the masses. But I think it also just depends on your goals and what you're trying to do as a business. I think precedent is also really important. Like, if you've been showing up in the Super Bowl for the past 15 years and you don't show up this year, what does that mean? What does that signal? And so I think that's something that the companies are also thinking about. And to your point about the teasers that are coming out, I've been following the Uber Eats scandal kind of closely, because they did put out that teaser, which I loved, by the way. Who doesn't love the Beckhams, right? But they're now catching some flack for how they handled the allergy issue. And so they're having to deal with like a little bit of a scandal ahead of their big moment. And would that be the case if they just dropped it on a very busy night of the Super Bowl? I don't know. So do they bring on more criticism than necessary because of it? It's interesting to watch.
Yeah, that's a good take.
It's a very good take. I feel like I'm Black Friday deals before Thanksgiving, though, or before Halloween. Sorry, where it's like, okay, we get it, thanks. And to your point, I think that this is a good splash, and it could be the pinnacle of your ad campaign. But I think if you do it right, it blends for the next 12 months. That you blend from it. And Anheuser-Busch comes to mind of half a dozen of their ads from many years that have defined a generation in the 90s.
Eleanor, I think one of the, kind of the big storyline that is, kind of shaken the journalism community over the last, really decade plus has been, the traditional newspapers that have been, really hurt, losing advertising, cutting staff, reducing staff. And then you've got startups that are coming in and competing. It's making it a lot more difficult. Recently we saw the layoffs at the LA Times, the Washington Post offering buyout packages. What does this mean for, kind of legacy media, and how does this impact PR pros, where it already seems like there's a ratio of like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 PR pros for every journalist, if not more? What does that mean for us, when we're trying to gain coverage for our business or our clients? Is the future just bleak, or do we have to go the untraditional route and maybe focus on digital a little bit more?
The ratio a year ago was 6-to-1.
I was way off.
Way off.
Well, I would imagine that it's gotten worse, given all the recent layoffs. So yeah, you bring up a really great point, is that how do you break through when newsrooms are overstretched, and when it's such a tough environment? It's difficult. What I've seen is, yes, more and more companies, more and more brands are relying on non-traditional outlets. They're going niche. They're going to podcasting. I'm also seeing a rise in owned content. So all of those really great journalists who have been let go are being scooped up by corporate communication teams. and they're, creating content of their own, and they're putting a news hook behind it. They're launching their own podcast. They have their own blogs. They have their own owned content that they're really focused on. It's fascinating to me because the way that you make news is by having something interesting to say, right? And if you do, you will be able to break through. And so by having those journalists who have an eye for the news, I think it does give these companies a leg up. But as I mentioned, like what's the goal at the end of the day? Who are you trying to reach? The media landscape feels bleak right now. It definitely does. Luckily at Axios, like we have been able to grow and expand, especially in local markets. That's where we're really focused, telling those local stories that matter to our readers. We're very much audience first. We're also zooming in on subject matter expertise. So like Axios Communicators, for example, is a pretty niche concept, but we've got an active group of readers who are very, very engaged. And, that's what we're focused on, is serving the audience and their needs. I think you might have seen publications who aren't thinking in that way. That might be why they're not as successful. If they're just chasing clicks, they're just chasing headlines. So I think it's a combination of knowing where your audience is. If your audience is reading Axios, go there, pitch them, get to know them. If your audience is niche, don't be afraid. And also be able to explain. That's where data comes in. Be able to explain to your principals, like, here's why we're going to this podcast. I know you've never heard of it, but everybody who uses our product does. And so if you have that data that you can take to them, that's really, really important. It's not always about the impressions, because again, this is something that Lulu Maservi said at an event that we hosted a couple months ago, is like, what does the public in public relations even mean? Like, do we care about the public, or do we care about very specific audiences? Like, what does it serve me to have 2 million impressions if none of them are invested in our product and none of them are going to move, right? Like none of them are going to convert. So I think thinking in that way, it's not as terrifying when you think about the shifting media landscape. You just have to get more creative. And again, I think those digital strategies are a piece of it. I think owned content is a piece of it. I think just understanding audience needs is a huge piece of it.
Yeah, and I think kind of like shifting your mindset too, that, if you do have a piece of content that is out there, that you can leverage it in so many different platforms. I mean, you look at content creators, they do this all the time with YouTube channels, like cutting little clips, turning them into shorts. They're repurposing a 10-minute video in so many different ways, so they're maximizing the views. I think it's just incredible. So maybe communicators should kind of think it in that lens, that if you don't end up in like the New York Times, it's okay. But maybe your executive was on a podcast, clip it, put it out on your own digital channels, put some paid support behind it, and perhaps the reach and the impact could be more beneficial in the long run.
You mentioned owned media, and I was just wondering if you could give some points or tips to different companies that have owned media, because with the Google trying to get rid of the cookie lists for more of the advertising side of it, Facebook and their walled gardens, or Meta, sorry. And to Austin's point, repurposing a lot of that. So what are some of the best owned media that you're starting to see that could be repurposed to say, hey, you should cover us?
Who does a pretty good job is Amazon. Their Amazon blog gets so many views. Their owned content, specifically like the short videos that they do, I think get a lot of play. There are also always podcasts that I think are interesting. It's all about just having something interesting to say and knowing what your audience wants to hear. So those are some that come to mind immediately. I mean, Spotify, they're really great with their own stuff. They generate a lot. I mean, think of Wrapped, right? Like that is a huge owned campaign in and of itself. It's like a marketer's dream. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just all about having something to say. There's a story that I always think is so interesting. It was from a life sciences organization, and they were brought up during some political hot button issue. They were brought up, and so their CEO wrote a op-ed. They pitched it to the top places. Nobody wanted it because they weren't like explicit enough around Trump and Biden or something, but they weren't willing to go there. They weren't willing to say that. So instead they're like, you know what, if they don't take it, that's fine. We'll just put it out on LinkedIn. We'll just send it to our our lists, put it out on LinkedIn, get our voices heard. Every news outlet covered it because it actually did say something and it was important. So again, leveraging executive comms, like thought leadership is such a, everybody kind of rolls their eyes at that term. But I do think that there is a lot of potential there and that people are paying attention to. And we know people care about what executives think when it comes to social issues, when it comes to return to office. We know that people want to know what they think. And so putting it out there in a smart way and kind of utilizing that can also generate news in and of itself.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, the Edelman Trust Barometer comes out in I think the third week of January every year. So it came out a few weeks ago. There's always a lot of good content and data that supports that. So if you haven't checked it out, it's one of our favorites. Of the podcast. We discuss it on an annual basis. But Eleanor, we've got a few more minutes left on the show before we wrap. But the last episode that Thomas and I recorded, we were kind of doing our review of our predictions in 2023. And not to brag, but we had 10 predictions. We nailed 8 of them. And we gave ourselves partial credit on the other 2. So, I mean, if anyone wants, to pay us to prognosticate, we've got that in the bag. But I want to turn it on you for a moment. If we're having this conversation in, the first quarter of 2025, what is the one storyline that you will believe, will have an impact, whether it's positively or negatively, on Comms Pros this year?
It's a great question.
And no pressure. We were batting
no pressure.
800.
Yeah. Well, for me, I'm always thinking a lot about reputational risk. It's an election year. Everything is political. And so the years past have been very social media driven elections. I think this year is going to be an AI election, whatever that means. And that's what I'm paying attention to in 2025. What that means, how companies are embracing AI, what it means for society, how companies are responding. I think everybody's kind of on guard in 2024. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And then what does that mean for 2025? How are people responding? The misinformation piece is a big one, right? And so that's really what I'm paying attention to. I don't know what type of prediction that is. The prediction is keep standing guard, stay prepared, stay alert. That's really what I'm focused on.
I'm watching the AI very closely too, and I know yesterday the FCC just passed the rule about the robocalls and AI voices and people not going to vote, and it's like the first time that bipartisans passed a rule that narrow that fast. Yeah. How do you think that's going to affect some of our ability to do practice? Not that robocalls should have ever been legal.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you're a company that's still relying on robocalls, we should talk offline about your strategy.
Yes.
Young people aren't there. The future of your consumer base isn't there. So yeah, I mean, I think you brought up a good point that it was a bipartisan, quick solution. I think we'll see more of that. Hopefully in the next couple of love a bipartisan moment. So hopefully we'll see more of that.
Yes.
In the years, months to come. But yes, how AI will impact the election, how it will impact people's work, how it will impact how people receive and deliver information. I think that's what I'm paying a lot of attention to.
All right. Well, Eleanor, I think we've got some great insights from you, and it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And we're definitely thankful to have you on the Business Communicators podcast this week. And we assume that most of our listeners probably already subscribe to your newsletter and follow you on LinkedIn and X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it. For those that don't, kind of walk us through the newsletter, maybe what you're working on in the coming weeks, and what the best way is for them to stay in contact and follow your work.
Sure. So Axios Communicators hits inboxes every Thursday at noon Eastern. And again, we focus on the topics and trends that impact how businesses, leaders, employers, brands communicate with their different stakeholders. We're also looking a lot at how audience demands have changed, audience habits have changed, and what that means for these communicators. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me through Axios.com. And for what I'm working on, I mean, I'm just, again, following the news of the day. That's one thing that I'm really grateful for is Axios has a very active newsroom, and I'm always trying to find the comms angle in the things that my colleagues are reporting. So I feel lucky to have a newsroom like that, to have the resources behind a communicators vertical. And so there will be more to come. We're hoping to expand and grow, do more events, meet more of you in person. The communicators audience is an engaged one, and we want to keep it that way. So again, Axios.com or on LinkedIn.
Yeah, definitely follow Eleanor's work. And of course,
Yes.
you can also follow her on X at emailhawk as well. But, if you just want, morning news or evening news, Axios is also a great resource as well. You can get all of the information you need to know in 3 to 5 minutes. It's wonderful. And there's newsletters for anyone and everything. So we 10 out of 10 recommend that. But Thomas, any parting words?
No, and I was going to echo that sentiment. As I get all three of the ones, the national, and then the communications, and then also now the local Houston one was the first one. And I can always tell that when my spidey senses start going off is when I see not the same story, but the different throughout all of them. This is how this is going to affect society. It's going to affect us as a profession. It's going to affect us locally. So kudos to you and covering all that, and I enjoy it. And that's my closing thoughts on your work.
Well, there we go. Eleanor, we appreciate you for joining us on the Business Communicators. And, for those that want to follow her work, again, subscribe to the newsletter. Check her out on social media as well. If you want to follow our work, just search @Biz Communicators on all the social platforms. You can find us there. But on behalf of our guest this week, Eleanor Hawkins, my co-host, Thomas Bain, my name's Austin Staton. See you next week. Take care, everyone.
You've been listening to the Business Communicators. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and leave us a 5-star review.